Hello, everybody. Good morning, good evening, good night, good afternoon, whatever, wherever, and whenever you are. I hope you're having a blessed week. Um, this week, I want to talk to you a bit about the causes of the American Revolution. As I've said before, and I'll say it again, historians really enjoy talking about causes and consequences, and so we're going to do that, of course, here. But the traditional narrative, as I was taught it, and perhaps you were taught it this way too, was that the causes of the American Revolution had to do with a series of taxes that were levied upon the colonials, things like the Tea Act and the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts and the Sugar Act, also known as the Molasses Act, right? And that narrative isn't entirely wrong. But we have to place those taxes into a much broader context in order for us to really understand why the colonials responded to them with revolution and ultimately for calls of independence. And in order to do that, we need to really understand what the relationship is between the people and their government. Now, throughout a lot of European history, kings ruled by this idea known as the divine right of king. And the divine right of king, broadly speaking, stated that God had ordained the monarchy to overrule the people, and therefore to challenge the monarchy would be to challenge God himself. And therefore, the king or queen themselves were elevated. They were a better kind of people. Their blood was noble in some particular way, and therefore the relationship was one of subservience, right? The peasants, the people themselves were subservient to the monarchy. Well, throughout English history during the 1600s, really, there was a lot of turbulence going on. There's civil wars going on. There's monarchies getting their heads cut off. We think of Charles, and ultimately there's the king is thrown out of power, then he's restored to power. And there's just a lot of things going on in England that leads some folks to begin to contemplate the relationship between the people and their government. And this is going to usher in a European and somewhat of an American movement known as the Enlightenment. And we'll be talking about that this week. But one of the central thinkers of the Enlightenment, who was really pivotal in coming to bringing ideas to the United States, was a man by the name of John Locke. Now, he'll be long dead before the United States ever is created, but his ideas had a lasting impact. And so in order to understand why the colonials respond to the taxes the way they do, we have to understand that part of the reason for that is because of a change in perception. And a lot of that comes from John Locke. And John Locke argues, and you see this riddled throughout the Declaration of Independence, you see this riddled throughout the United States Constitution, but basically John Locke argued that the government exists not because of divine right, but rather the government exists because the people who wield the power, the people themselves have the power. This is why in the Constitution we have the preamble which starts as "we the people," right? That the people then consent and they give up some of their rights. And John Locke is one of the very first to talk about rights. He talks about life, liberty, and property. He basically says that at times people infringe upon our rights, and so what we do is we give up a small amount of rights. We create a government through a social contract. The people themselves come together and they agree upon this government, and the purpose of government is to protect our rights. Now, this is very, very different than monarchy, right? And so as this idea begins to spread throughout Europe, begins to spread into the Americas, there begins to develop a change of thinking about the way in which we, the people, that is at this point English colonists, are supposed to respond to the government, right? And when the taxes begin to get levied in 1763, 65, and forward, the colonials in the Americas begin to feel as though the government is no longer protecting their rights. It believes that they are no longer allowing the English as citizens to live and act as citizens. And so we have to be very much aware that the Enlightenment and the Enlightenment thinking significantly contributes to the way in which the colonials respond. It's also important to bear in mind that unlike many other nations who colonized the Americas, the English had allowed the colonists to basically live somewhat freely. This is not to say that the monarchy and the parliament never attempted to control the colonists. At the time, you have a mercantile economic system going on, and so indeed the The English are going to do what they can to try to control the commerce and the economy in the colonies in order to benefit England themselves. But for the most part, the people in the Americas, the English that is, were allowed to worship as they wanted. They established their own governmental institutions. You think of something like the House of Burgesses in Virginia. They were able to set their own tax codes. And for the most part, the English colonials were permitted a sense of self-government and an aspect of self-government which was really unheard of. And so they were already accustomed to basically governing themselves without much interference from England. And so when the taxes begin to come down, that sense of self-government coupled with John Locke's ideas really begins to stir the pot. Now, there's another event that we're going to be talking about known as the First Great Awakening. It's a religious revival movement. And this is really the very first American historical movement, if you want to call it that. This was a movement that in many ways affected all the colonies. You see, the Enlightenment was influential, but it was really influential among folks who could read and folks who could think. And they would go to the taverns and they would talk about these ideas. By contrast, the First Great Awakening was an awakening that cut across all ethnic lines. It cut across all class lines, gender lines, racial lines, and it really brought people together in a very important way. And we'll talk about the specifics of the First Great Awakening throughout this week. But one of the important aspects that is very accurate about the First Great Awakening is that it challenged church authority. And what's interesting is that there were many folks who thought that bringing in the revivalist movement would help to actually control congregations, but the exact opposite happened. Really, what the First Great Awakening did was it preached a message about choice in your salvation. You know, as John Locke says, you can choose your government. And in fact, that's one of the things I didn't make mention of. John Locke actually argues that you should throw out bad governments. You can choose your government, right? The First Great Awakening does a very similar thing in the sense that they say you can choose your salvation. You can choose to get rid of ministers you don't like. And that's very different from the Puritan mold that states that God has already written your ticket and there's no free will about it. The First Great Awakening challenges that. And really, it's interesting that the Enlightenment, which is a very secular movement, and the Great Awakening, which is a very religious movement, they very much come together to hone this idea that you can make choices for yourself. And it really begins to bring people together to think of themselves not so much as English citizens, but as Americans. And that culminates in a change of thinking that's really important to understand, because outside of that context, it doesn't really make sense why the colonists are so upset about the taxes that are going to be levied upon them. Now, the taxes are important because that's really the impetus for why the American Revolution really starts. But to understand why the taxes are levied, you really have to be aware of what the French and Indian War was. In fact, there was a number of different conflicts between the colonists and native peoples throughout all of colonial history. But the one that's probably the most significant is the French and Indian War. This is also referred to as the 7 Years' War, and that was really a European conflict. And the French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War are the same war, except we call it French and Indian for those who fought on the American hemisphere. But basically, it starts over a dispute over land and territory, particularly in the Ohio Valley. George Washington, first president of the United States, effectively begins this conflict as he was sent by the governor of Virginia to kick the French out of the Ohio Valley, who had entered into the region, and they began to build forts, specifically Fort Duquesne. And this was problematic for the English because the British monarchy had already granted tracts of land to English citizens. Of course, nobody asks the Native Americans who are already living there whether or not we can give away their homes, but that's not the point. The point is that George Washington, who was not very diplomatic, they basically start a conflict which becomes known as the French and Indian War. The war does not begin well for the English, but it ends well for them, and in the end, the British are going to be able to acquire a significant tract of land. In fact, one of the strategies that's going to happen is that the British will decide, after a new government comes into place in England under the leadership of William Pitt, is that rather than just kicking the French out of certain territories, the strategy now will turn to, let's just kick the French out of everywhere and take their land, which is in many ways what happens. And the war comes to an end with the Peace of Paris, and it does so in 1763. But this is going to bankrupt the English treasury, and so that's why the taxes begin to be implemented. Now, like I said before, taxes and control had been placed upon the colonists before, but the colonists were really good at smuggling, and so they could get around, they can circumvent some of these regulations. And the new government in England is attempting to address the issues of smuggling because it hurts their mercantilist system. And so they begin to levy certain taxes. The very first tax is actually not a new tax. It's called the Sugar Act, but it's based upon an act that I believe was passed in 1733, known as the Molasses Act. And in fact, the very first act actually reduced the tax from 6 cents per gallon of sugar to 3 cents. And the idea here was that if we reduce the amount of cost on the tax, then people wouldn't smuggle. That doesn't stop, we still smuggle. But the taxes are, for the most part, not really listened to. It cost the British more money to enforce them than they got money from them, so they eventually pitched them out, throw them away. But then they begin to pass a series of other taxes, and the Stamp Act was the next act to be passed, and it was really problematic because, of course, this affected anybody who did business, as opposed to the Sugar Act, who basically just really affected New England merchants. But these taxes, as they develop, it really creates two camps of people: the Sons of Liberty, the Loyalists, and this is going to be divisive. And people are going to start saying no taxation without representation. The basic idea here is that we, as the English colonists in the Americas, had absolutely no representation in Parliament. We didn't have any say as to whether or not we should be taxed. And the history of the English says that if you're going to be taxed, you have to give your consent, and no one gave consent. And so over a period of time, a series of events unravel. Of course, you've got the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, and in the end, you're going to have the battles of Lexington and Concord. And the battles of Lexington and Concord actually happened in 1775, before we declare independence. And so just be aware, we actually start war with England before we ever declare independence. And it's not really clear what the purpose of the fighting is in 1775. Are we fighting to reconcile the relationship? Are we fighting to gain independence? It's just not clear. That's going to become much more obvious when we finally do declare independence in 1776. A move that is very much encouraged by the publication in January of 1776 of a pamphlet called Common Sense by Thomas Paine. We're going to talk more about him, but I think Thomas Paine, his little pamphlet, Common Sense, really contributed to people understanding that, you know, we need to not be a part of England anymore. You know, one of the arguments that he makes, for example, in Common Sense is this. He says, you know, some of you are saying that we should not have independence. You argue that we've only ever prospered because we've been connected to England our whole lives, and therefore we can't envision a place or a space where we would prosper without her. And Thomas Paine says that's a fallacious argument. That's ridiculous. You know, he says you might as well say that because a child has only ever had breast milk, that therefore he should never have meat. You know, and that's rather ridiculous, don't you think? You know, you can't be 14, 15 years old and coming home trying to get a snack from mom in that way. That just doesn't work. And so Common Sense is really arguing that, you know, we can prosper, we can thrive, we can be independent. You know, he says, you know, things like, as long as the custom of Europeans is to eat food, you here in the Americas will be able to grow crops, grow fruit, and send it to them. As long as they continue to eat, you'll make money, you'll be okay. And it really encourages folks to sort of fall along the independence side. And so we do declare our independence. And that's kind of where we're going to stop this week. But hopefully that's a broad overview, and it helps to understand, or at least helps you to understand kind of the trajectory of things. Obviously, we'll get in more detail with your reading and films for this week, but hopefully that provides a broad overview and helps to provide some important context. So that's what we got. If you guys have questions, let me know, and I'll get back to you. Otherwise, as always, go in peace, be warm and filled. May the force be with you. Live long and prosper, and may the odds forever be in your favor. Sorry, guys. Woo, too much coffee this morning, all right? All right, guys, have a great week, and enjoy the class.